welcome to Benji and Abby Busk with James Hastings and Joel Nash this week, and they were the creators of Pardoned.
Hello everyone, my name's James. I am the composer, lyricist and musical director of Pardoned the Musical.
A new musical.
A new musical.
A new musical.
A new musical.
Not an old one. Hi, I'm Joel. I wrote the book for Pardoned and I also directed it.
If people didn't know what Pardoned's about, James, can you give us a quick 30-second summary about what the musical is about?
Yeah, of course. So Pardoned focuses on the life of World War II hero Alan Turing, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with because of the recent film The Imitation Game starring Benedict Cumberbatch. And basically Alan Turing was a mathematician, and he is most famous for breaking the Enigma code, which was known as the unbreakable code that was used by the Nazis to send secret messages. And it's kind of widely agreed that if he hadn't have broken this code, then we might well have lost World War II and the world would look very different. So he's really a national treasure, although sadly he wasn't treated as such. And our musical follows the whole journey of his life, from when he was a young boy to then after winning the war, when he was convicted of gross indecency because he was a gay man. And at the time, being a gay man was a punishable offence. And therefore, he was chemically castrated and actually committed suicide, which is just horrendous. Oh, even talking about it now, it's really, he was just treated horrendously by the government. And therefore, he became the figurehead of a recent bill that was tried to be passed through Parliament, which was to pardon gay men of previous historical crimes. So these are living gay men, elderly gay men now, that were convicted of crimes that are no longer crimes now. And our story is set half in the present in Parliament, debating this called the Turing Bill, which was to try and pardon these men, and then half set in the past, following the life of Alan Turing, so kind of the figurehead of that movement. And throughout the tale, we kind of grow up with Alan and experience the injustices that he's faced. And we also hear the reasonings to and for are the same, but for and against the passing of this bill. And that's really what the meat of Pardoned is about. It's the idea that, you know, how should we treat others that are different to us, and, you know, how can we move forward?
Amazing, thanks, James.
Yeah, so before we get into Pardoned, should we just ask you both sort of what you've been up to in lockdown? James, do you want to go first?
Oh, goodness me.
Where do you begin?
Where do you begin? To be honest with you, it's been a very different existence than normal in more ways than one. I've still been songwriting and little bits and bobs, but the show that I was in prior to lockdown got cancelled, so that was kind of the same for lots of our, you know, fellow actor friends. So that was kind of everything kind of took off the table. So I've been basically trying to keep myself busy in every way possible. So I've started a new vegan blog. Shout out to all the vegans out there. Woo. And I have been doing stuff like clearing the house out. My life is so boring. You do not want to hear about me. Joel, say something exciting. I've gone for lots of walks. That's been great.
I spent the first 2 weeks pulling my hair out and kind of being like, okay, what do I do now? Because I'd just come off the back of the tour. So I was still in kind of tour mode. And then suddenly I was just stationary in one place, which felt very odd. But no, I've been filling time with writing poems. I'm working on a new project with Benji, a new Bohemians project. So that's been, I've been very, secrets. But I've been incredibly grateful for that, because it's something to do. And I bought a guitar not too long ago, so I've been trying to get better at the guitar. So that's me, really, just writing, cooking, and sitting on my bum.
Being the legend that is Joel Nash.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, amazing.
Well, it's great to get you on. I think I wasn't a part of the pardon process like at all, so it was really nice to come and see the final product, which is really, really lovely. And so I'd love to know where the idea came from. Like, what was the very first seed that brought this project along? Probably looking at you, James, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's a question for
Goodness.
James.
Gosh, it's been such a long time since I've kind of thought about the very beginnings of it, because it kind of defined our end of drama school experience by quite a lot. I think the initial seed was planted when I was watching a BBC News, or was I watching? I think maybe on the BBC News app on my phone, and I saw a news story basically about how John Nicholson, who later became the protagonist of the show, a Scottish MP, he was basically putting forward this bill to pardon gay men of previous historical crimes that are now no longer crimes. And the fact that it basically was like did not get passed. And I remember reading about it, and then they had the testimonials of some older gay men. One of them, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, was called George Montague.
Yeah.
Who was a really charismatic old gay, like one of the classic queens. And it was really heartbreaking because there are people, these were like real men that are literally still branded criminals. And I was just infuriated by it. It made me so angry, which I think is quite a common place to start a creative process from. I was really angry about it, and I felt very emotional about it as well. So it kind of, that's where the initial idea came from. And then I ended up playing a scene from The Imitation Game, which is the kind of biopic about Alan Turing, for our showreel scenes, our end of drama school showreels. And out of playing Alan Turing in a couple of those scenes, I actually wrote the first few songs. So it came as like a kind of character exploration thing from playing him like that. So then I wrote 3 songs off the back of that, which then turned into a composition brief that, again, we had to do as part of our time in drama school at Rose Bruford, where I shared a song from the show or how I thought it would go. And it was really difficult. I mean, lots went wrong. But then, I don't know, there was something special about it. And I thought, I would love to see, it's still not finished. This issue still isn't dealt with. And it was a really good test for me. And then that's when I approached Joel, because he'd been writing some of his own work. He'd recently written a play called The Escapist, which was very good. So I kind of approached him and was like, look, I've got this idea, but I don't think I have the discipline, or, I need a partner basically to take it further. And that's when Jolie Boy jumped on board.
Yeah, and Joel, could you tell us a bit about like how you started your relationship creatively together then? How did you start to write the show, and what was your process as both writers collaborating together?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I think the first thing we were aware of was just the amount of research that would be required for this sort of project.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only did we need to know a great deal about Alan Turing's life, we also needed to know about the pardon bill, the Turing bill, and what that meant historically in terms of, the history of the LGBTQ community. So I think the first thing we did was kind of dive into research. And we were incredibly lucky in that one of our fellow course members, Eleanor Kane, her mum, Joan McAlpine, was an MP, still is an MP for the SNP, and happened to know John Nicholson, who wrote the bill. So I think when we knew it was getting serious was when we got invited round to John Nicholson's house in Shoreditch, and we spent about 2 hours with him, just asking him all the questions about the Turing bill. And he was fantastic, wasn't he, James? And he did not shy away from giving us a good show, and he was very candid, which was refreshing. I think I know I felt going into speaking to him a bit of trepidation, a bit dubious, because MPs, they can sometimes get a bad rap, but but he was incredibly candid and generous of his time, and we learned a great deal about the Turing Bill and his involvement with it, which really helped when writing the scenes in Parliament and developing this character of John Nicholson, which James said kind of became one of the protagonists of the stories.
And then how did you sort of write together? How did you negotiate that relationship, and how did it work? I'm just interested to know.
I think I really love how Joel's first thing was like about the research, because that is true. That was our first thing we should have done. But I am like really rubbish at things like that. And that's one of the reasons I needed Joel so badly, because I'm so bad. I'm very like impulsive and emotionally driven. So it was very much like a lot of the time I would write something like, oh, I've come up with this great idea about this thing, and Joel would be like, that never happened, like we can't just do something that isn't a thing. So I think that's why we were a really good pair in terms of navigating how we wrote, because we're very good balance of each other. He's, you know, very analytical and creative in quite like a methodical way, and I was a bit more scatty and all over the place, I think, for a lot of the time. But there was a lot of like us having meetings over, you know, I remember there was one when we were trying to decide the title. It was like 3 hours like just sat staring at a piece of paper on my bed in our student house.
Yeah.
And we were like just crossing them off and going, no, that's not right.
And I think pulling other members of your household into the bedroom for to hear their opinion as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of the actual process, one thing I didn't realize would be the case when we started off was how it's quite tricky as someone writing a book and someone writing the music. You can't always work simultaneously together. There were moments where I would have to go off, do my research so I could start to kind of put the foundations down for a story, and only then could I go to James and present these ideas and go, well, this is the story. I think this part perhaps would lend itself to a song, a piece of music. But I know James did quite a lot of waiting around for me. And then once I'd handed that over to James, I would wait around for James to come up with some songs. So it wasn't always us sat in coffee shops, scribbling away together. A lot of it was quite individual work as well.
So should we talk about the Other Palace performance and sort of how that came about and the lead up to it, and how bonkers all of it was?
Yeah. I mean, so we were incredibly lucky. I mean, I think it's worth saying, like, for this first production of Pardoned, a lot of it was to do with just how supportive a lot of our peers are and the staff at Rose Bruford, in particular Tom Atwood, who was our music teacher. And he is probably one of the most nurturing people I think I've ever met. I'm sure it's probably the same for you guys too. But he found us a space in the studio at the Other Palace, which is where we did our performance of Pardoned, which was absolutely fantastic and exciting news. But I think also when we first heard this, it was incredibly daunting. And it was also, logistically speaking, it put restrictions on the staging, because the studio space at the Other Palace, for those of you who haven't been, it's an incredibly small stage. So we needed to fit 7 actor musos and a grand piano on this tiny little cabaret stage, which obviously meant we had to be super conscious of this in rehearsals. So there was a lot of thought went into that. But yeah, and then in terms of our cast, we borrowed some fantastic actor musos, mainly from the second year. We were in our third year at the time. They were in their second year of training. We had a few third years and one amazing first year. So it was a nice amalgamation of different year groups from the actor muso course. Do you want to say something, James?
Oh God. About the Other Palace, I think what was the most kind of striking thing about the Other Palace was just how it really was a Bohemian experience. By that I mean it was everybody like scrambling. I remember we got Elliot on board to do, was it Elliot doing lighting for it? Sound. That makes sense. It makes more sense than Elliot doing lighting.
Imagine.
At one point, you know, we were like, we had Tom Vasey and Faye and this incredible team of stage management that were like supporting us and behind us, but it was absolutely mental. I think it was so nerve-wracking from a completely different way than being an actor is and going on stage, just having to kind of sit back and watch everyone kind of throw themselves at it. But they did, and it was literally just the tenacity of that like Bohemian spirit of like, we're going to put on a show, and even if, you know, the cello falls off the stage or it's black at one point, you know, we'll get it on. And it really was like an absolute like labor. It was giving birth to it, because the reason we had to do it in the other palace was because in Bruford itself there were literally no performance spaces.
I forgot that.
So we were rehearsing like outside the library toilets the week before the show. It was mental, but that also made it feel like even more of a triumph, and made it also really emotional when we finally put it up.
I think that's the thing though, like we've got to remember particularly the second years, everyone was still training at the time, so our rehearsals were literally shoehorned in to these already incredibly busy days of our cast members. So it was literally seizing any time we could, and just to put this thing together. So yeah, it really was like I don't know, it felt like an impossible feat at times, but yeah, we got there.
Yeah, because I remember coming to the other past performance, and it was just a fantastic, like amazing feat that you'd created, and I was so proud of you sitting down having our reserve seat, and it was fantastic. But then obviously life after the other palace, you took it to Cornwall, and you had like almost like a residential R&D in Cornwall. So talk to us about that. Like, is that what your next step wanted to be, or do you feel like there's more life in that?
Yeah, I think after the other palace, I think everyone, including me and James, were exhausted and needed a bit of time away from that project, because I think we'd invested so much into it. And also, you know, we were all graduating from drama school and trying to get our own careers kind of up. And what am I trying to say? Basically, we had to sort out our own lives for a little bit. But I remember, I think, did the three of us have a meeting at some point?
I think it was you and I, Joel. We had we were having a chat about doing something down in Cornwall. Yeah,
and I think you know, me and James both felt that although we were incredibly proud of the work we did and the show we put on at the other palace, by no means was it the finished article. And yeah, we wanted time to rewrite it. And I think we felt the show we put on at the other palace, perhaps the text and the music wasn't particularly integrated as well as it could be. And I think the more we talked about it, the more we realized there were lots of things we wanted to work on. And we kind of, as soon as you start to do that, the hunger for the project builds. And we talked about potentially doing an R&D, because I think, you know, with the show we put on at the other palace, it felt like we'd written the show, we rehearsed it, and we put it on. And I think what I learned from that experience was that when you're working on a piece of new musical theatre, so much of it, especially when you're working with actor musicians, so much of it happens in the room. And I think we needed a week of just experimentation rather than being too separatist about it and being like, let's write it, let's rehearse it, let's put it on. I think with actor musicianship musicals, which are just, you know, it's a minefield of problem solving, you need to all be in a room together. So we were lucky enough to get a space at Sterts Theatre in Cornwall, which is a theatre I owe a lot to, because it's where I used to do my youth theatre when I was a teenager. And this is fantastic open air theatre in the middle of Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, about 20 minutes from my parents' house. And they said we could have the space for a week for free.
Wow.
So it was like, well, we can't turn this down. Do you know what I mean? It's almost too good to be true. But the next thing we had to worry about, of course, was fundraising, getting our actors, getting everyone down to Cornwall, which was fun, wasn't it, Benj?
It was a challenge, but I love a challenge. I love organising things, so that was...
Yeah. and basically just how many of us were there? There was 12?
There was about 12 altogether. So
So
including
12 Bohemians staying in my parents' house for a week in Cornwall. Yeah, it was fantastic.
You can only imagine what happened.
Yes, there was lots of drinking, lots of late night DMCs in the hot tub.
Do you want to define what DMCs mean, Joel?
Deep, meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I'm not about the small talk. Well, I've lost my track now. What are we saying? Cornwall. But it was fantastic, and we were incredibly lucky to have that space. And I think in terms of the progression of the show itself, I think we definitely learnt a lot. I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about that, James.
Yeah, I think like Joel was saying, there was definitely a feeling from both of us that the show wasn't over or in its final form. It was very much a needs must when we got to the other palace of, like, for example, we had to cut a lot of material to fit it into the allotted time, and there were lots of logistical things that made it difficult. But there are a couple of things that also made us want to keep developing it. One being that John Nicholson actually couldn't, through like unforeseeable personal circumstances, couldn't come to the show himself, and we were kind of doing, it's kind of the show about him a little bit, and also from the fact that still in England and Wales, big up the Scottish government for actually taking the Turing bill on, it's still not passed. So the whole message of the show and what we're writing about has still not gone away, this issue. So I think that was like another thing where we were just like, this clearly needs to live on. So yeah, we got together, went down to Cornwall, and we had to put on a sharing to the kind of local theatrical community at Sterts, people that Joel grew up with. And we had to kind of strip it all back to basics and go back to, what is the story? How are we telling it? Is this really necessary? Do we really need a song here? Would this be better in a movement sequence? Things like that. Like Joel's saying, you literally cannot, the two of us over a coffee, decide whether it's going to work. But it was very interesting for me because as a composer, I had originally written it, going back to what you said earlier, Abby, with active musicians in mind. So the way that I composed the score and wrote the lyrics wasn't necessarily like onto piano, and then I had a piano score. I kind of wrote it just kind of went from my head into a fully fledged arrangement that I could sort of hear on Sibelius. So I actually had a version of the show that I couldn't play myself because it was just what I could hear and then what everyone else could play. So for me, a big part of it was basically doing the opposite of what I would imagine a normal musical process is, where instead of going from a piano score and expanding it out into a fully fleshed arrangement, for me personally, I wanted to use the time to try and see whether I could condense that fully fleshed out arrangement into like a piano score, therefore meaning that in the future, who knows, potentially companies could put on the show without acting musos, as well as the practical point that when you're performing as an acting muso company, obviously every different company are going to have different skills. And you'll really narrow the amount of people that can perform your work if you say, I have to have a cellist, I have to have a violinist. I kind of wanted to create this score bible of a basic piano score that then, depending on whichever cast in the future we might get, I could then arrange, like, so it went out to in to back out, if that makes sense.
Like mathematics.
Yeah. Making it adaptable is, that's a really good way of looking at it.
But it was an amazing experience, and in Cornwall itself, the feedback we got was amazing from the production. It was really hard again. Don't let everyone underestimate how difficult it is to write new acting musician musical theatre. But actually, we were really lucky that somebody, Joel, you've got to correct me if I'm wrong here, but at the end of the sharing, a lady came up to us whose best friend was Alan Turing's granddaughter. I think that's correct.
I think it was niece.
Niece.
Yeah,
Oh,
niece.
one level up. There you go. Alan Turing's niece, and she had brought with her a photo of herself and her best friend, his niece, at the Imitation Game premiere with Benedict Cumberbatch, and she was just saying, you know, if she would have seen this, that would have meant so much to her, and for him as well. I just think, you know, this needs to be sung, played, talked about, and that was really inspiring, and very rewarding for us, to know that kind of someone with that personal, because it's tangible, you know, still living history, could have that sort of connection to it as well.
Yeah, because the piece is so relevant and important still to this day, and as you said, it's living history. What's next? Where are we going to go next with it?
I think we were definitely making momentum in Cornwall, but the issue sometimes with having a company where actors also have their independent careers is that, you know, lots of things happen, people go off, so it's quite hard to keep the momentum up. But I think the main thing, what we were really discovering in Cornwall, was kind of, you know, we were integrating the music and the text, and I think the John Nicholson character became much more of a sort of indispensable part in the story. He became a sort of narrator character. So I think the next step would just to refine what we were doing in Cornwall, really, and movement as well became a huge part. We did a lot of movement workshops to discover how can we go from 2017 Parliament to kind of 1920s rural England, and how do we use that? So I think then the next question for Pardon would be, well, how do you keep all this fantastic movement that we discovered in Cornwall with actor musicians? What are the compromises? How do you do that? So there's a lot of unanswered questions still. I think we could definitely benefit from another R&D.
Yeah.
But as is the way with musicals, you could just keep going, can't you? They're so it's such a mammoth task that that time is really sort of, you know, you can never have enough time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of Benji and Abby Buskett with
Joel
and James.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.